conversation surrounding the MCU has been one of negativity for quite a while now. The end of the MCU is failing, the MCU is a joke. These aren't just YouTube video thumbnails, but sentiments held by many. Given the amount of attention these sorts of opinions have garnered online, the decline of the franchise has become impossible to ignore. But what constitutes the end of the MCU? Or the failure, or the death of, or what have you? Is it the fact that a Marvel movie isn't guaranteed to turn a profit anymore? Perhaps the panderous Disney Plus shows? Or maybe it's the fans losing interest. While the decline in quality was steady for a while, then quickly dropped out after the release of Endgame, there is one event, one catalyst, in my opinion, that adequately marked the final nail in the coffin that was the MCU. And that was the release of this film, The Marvels. We don't really need to discuss what this movie is or what it intended to be. People have been talking about it for the better part of a year. The delays, the reshoots, the rumors, and everything that surrounded the making of this film. It was a flop before it even flopped. It was a flop before we saw a trailer. It was doomed from the start. And in a weird way, it kind of took the world by storm, or the internet at least. But why? Why would Disney produce something that was so obviously bound to fail? Why release this to the public knowing full well what the reaction would be? Test screenings are a thing. People saw this film before it was released, including executives. There's no way that anyone could have thought this was a good idea, so what the hell? How does something like this happen? Let's take a closer look at all of it. The ins, the outs, not just of this film, but how the MCU went from this to this. So Disney bought Marvel in 2009 for $4 billion. Given that figure, obviously the investment paid off royally. The Marvel Cinematic Universe is the highest grossing film franchise of all time, with a total worldwide revenue of $29 billion. Coming in second is Star Wars at $10 billion, and third is Harry Potter at $9.5 billion. So it's not even a competition, really. And technically Spider-Man is second, but I didn't really know how that works with Marvel and Sony or whatever, so let's just ignore that. Point, the MCU has made an insane amount of money. Even as crappy as it's gotten, they're still on top and by a long shot. And for a time, Marvel knew how to give fans what they wanted. We got Thor and Iron Man and Captain America. It's not the A-Team, it's not the X-Men or the Fantastic Four, but this was a time before Disney owned Fox, so they couldn't make any of those films. And they did pretty good with what they had. But when it comes to franchises, there's always ulterior motives. There's merchandise, there's toys, spin-off cartoons, and kids' books, so they expanded the universe. The more films we make, the more characters we have popping off, the more action figures little Jimmy has to buy next time he's at the store with Mom. I'm not trying to paint merchandising in a negative light, but I am saying that there was a big incentive to push these films out as quickly as possible. All in all, and at the time, this wasn't the worst thing. Fans were getting what they wanted, more Marvel movies. And these are the same fans who read the comics, or buy their kids' toys, or buy posters for their dorm rooms. You get my point. But then something changed, certainly after Avengers Endgame, but I would argue it happened before. It started becoming less about what the fans wanted and more about what the company wanted. And you might say, well, Cletus, it's always been about what the company wanted. It's always about profits, and that's true. But it's worth pointing out that from 2009 up to about 2016, basically everybody was happy. Our goals aligned. The fans were getting what they wanted, Disney was making billions, and it was all hunky-dory. But as things in the world began to shift politically and even socially, so did what we saw on screen. Disney became more concerned with appearing virtuous rather than simply making a decent film. You end up with films like Captain Marvel, a total dud of a movie that made $1 billion because it was slapped right between Avengers Infinity War and Endgame. Or the Black Widow movie, 4 years too late. It's not about a woman in a leading role, obviously that's not the problem. The problem is, if Marvel cared so much about having a woman in a leading role, why did Black Widow come out 4 years late? And why was she already dead? If what occurred in that movie was set directly after Civil War, then why didn't they make that movie then? It's not a trick question, it's because they don't really care. They never did. All Disney cared about was profits, so suddenly in the late 2010s, news outlets began to report on how Marvel doesn't have enough women in the MCU. There aren't enough female superheroes, there isn't enough female representation. So to appear virtuous, Disney begins to make those films. Not because of popular demand, not because they were supremely popular characters that would make billions, but because of the image. They don't have enough options, so they just throw a Black Widow movie in there 4 years too late, and a Captain Marvel movie right in the middle of two of their most profitable films. Now naturally, since I'm talking about two films with female leads, there will be those people in the comments who think that's the only reason I'm bringing them up. But I bring them up because they are a perfect way to illustrate my point. Disney has an image. They are an image. And if a narrative begins to emerge that they are sexist because they don't have female superheroes, they look bad. It's not about the fans or the virtue or any of it. It's about profits. It's always about profits. So they fear if their image is tainted, their profits will be tainted as well. Therefore, insert female-led superhero film here. There are plenty of ways they could have done this from the get and been successful with it. There are loads of awesome female superheroes in Marvel's Legendarium, but instead they decided to do what they did, which was fine. But when said narrative began to emerge, it became less about fan service and more about the image. We have to make this film or our image will suffer. And it's not a coincidence that neither of those films were good films. They weren't somebody's passion project, they were films that were made because Disney said they had to be made. We gotta make them, or we look bad, end of story. Now, I'm not saying films like Captain America Civil War were passion projects either. Obviously not. Put every superhero we've got into the same room so we can sell some damn tickets and some damn toys, but that sort of a ploy is at the very least fan service. And I'm going to go ahead and assume that the individuals writing articles about how Marvel doesn't have enough female representation aren't really fans. They're not out buying comics. You end up with scenes like in the final in-game battle when all the ladies grouped up in that one shot. It's Disney practically screaming, "See, look at all these women we have." It's sad and inorganic. It's not about pleasing the fans, it's about pleasing the mob. And as I've stated in so many videos before, you make the fans you already have happy first, then you add your crap. And that doesn't mean no women, it means you continue to give the fans what the fans want. Good stories, characters they like, action, adventure, etc. See, the Captain Marvel Black Widow example is such a small example when you look at what the MCU turned into. Cherry-picking obscure characters from the comics to bring various levels of diversity to the MCU. Diversity is obviously not the problem, but creativity takes a back seat when Disney's driving because they don't care about how the characters are introduced, whether it's organic or creative or well-written or special. It's throw this person in so we can check off this box. And because of that fact, the quality takes a dip. It becomes less about the quality and more about the message, less about the fans and more about the mob. And when trying to please the mob, nobody wins, because the mob can't be pleased. They can't be reasoned with. With any enormously successful property, there will be those who want to hate on it. And if Disney had been able to ignore that and continue to make decent films, they likely could have evaded this outcome. The outcome being the ever-present cliche, superhero fatigue. Was it an inevitability, or was it avoidable? Shortly after the MCU skyrocketed to success, the market was overly saturated with superhero content. But nobody seemed to mind at first. I'd say the genre may have gotten stale after a while, but I still think there's more at play here. It can't be ignored that the quality has dropped off significantly. It's worth going back and rewatching some of the first MCU films. You'll find many of them aren't as great as you remember, but they're certainly better than what's happening now. If you look at the creatives involved in the making of a lot of the Marvel shows on Disney Plus, or even many of the recent films, you'll find that many of these creatives lack credits. They lack experience, have maybe only worked on one or two other projects, many of which not even adjacent to the genre that Marvel is pulling them into. They're under-tested and underdeveloped in their trade. And that's what it is, a trade. Writing is a skill, directing is a skill that takes time and experience to develop. But Disney doesn't want skilled tradesmen working on their productions, they want somebody they can control. We know this based on what we saw with Edgar Wright leaving the original Ant-Man production or Scott Derrickson leaving Doctor Strange. Quote, creative differences with the studio. That's what they like to say, right? That they had creative differences. But studio executives aren't creatives. They're businessmen and women. It's not their job to be creative or even be super involved in the making of these shows and films. James Gunn said it best when he was appointed CEO of the new DC Studios, that he's a writer at heart and wants to give creatives the freedom to do their jobs. He also said, quote, we're not going to be making movies until the screenplay is finished, end quote. I always found this quote interesting given that Gunn had just come off of a fairly long stint working with Marvel on the Guardians films. Delays, reshoots, rewrites, etc. seem to be commonplace at Marvel nowadays. And obviously, with the quantity of projects coming out in recent years, it wouldn't surprise me if this quote is a subtle dig at Marvel and some of the things Gunn had to deal with while working with them. But I digress. In terms of quality of modern Marvel projects, it's not only about giving creatives the time, space, and freedom to do what they need to do, it's also about talent and skill, learned skill. It's not like all of the creatives at Marvel are under-tested. Taika Waititi, for example, is a really good filmmaker, and he was a good filmmaker before Thor Ragnarok, and he directed a good Thor movie, but he didn't write it. And when given the freedom to write the next one, Love and Thunder, it wasn't any good. It was all jokes. Marvel's fundamental misunderstanding of the creative process puts people in positions that aren't suited to their skill set, if they even have a skill set. As an example, there was a time when CGI couldn't be used as a crutch. Directors had to come up with creative ways to actually put what they wanted shown in front of the camera. When talking about this particular topic, I like to bring up Peter Jackson in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Jackson was given less than $300 million to work on those 3 films. Adjusted for inflation, that's $453 million today. Basing it off of the extended edition, we're talking about 10 hours of film, and quite possibly the greatest film trilogy of all time, at under $300 million. It's not particularly shocking for a single Marvel movie to top the $300 million budget mark, and practically all of them are over $200. Anyways, Jackson and his crew had to innovate to make that movie happen. He had to direct. They had to build things, make Arwen look like she's riding a horse up close even though she's really just in a wooden box rocking back and forth. Hire thousands of extras for an army, build a small-scale model of Minas Tirith, and have a little camera moving through the streets. Very little CGI assistance, something you barely see anymore. Why did Minas Tirith look so real as the camera flew above the city when Gandalf rode into Gondor? Because it was. They actually built it. As creatives work their way up in the industry, they learn these sorts of things. The tricks of the trade, the ways they can cut costs and make something look good without spending millions of dollars on contracts with CGI companies. They meet people who know how to build scale models and work in special effects, fight choreographers, so that instead of having to make an actor look like they're fighting, they can show them how to do it. It's these sorts of skills that make experienced Hollywood writers and directors invaluable, especially when it comes to projects with huge budgets like Marvel. It's not enough to just be creative, you need to know how to do your job. See, they hire a no-name, someone they can control, to direct or write or just work on a project. Someone who's so grateful for the opportunity that they'll do whatever the studio wants. They give them all the money in the world, thinking that they just need the tools to make it happen without realizing that these creatives lack the skill, talent, and experience to create something great. No amount of money can change that. These underexperienced creatives rely on CGI to make their vision become reality, because they never learned how to do it themselves without using CG as a crutch. And as more and more of these under-tested creatives are brought into the space, the more Hollywood loses the skill it used to have. There are so few highly skilled creatives left in Hollywood to work on these big budget films because Disney doesn't want to hire somebody with creative integrity. They want someone who will do what they want, and you'll never see Christopher Nolan directing a Marvel movie for this exact reason. Someone like that won't sacrifice their creative integrity and creative freedom. The preachy dialogue and the not-so-subtle social and political messaging in modern Marvel projects is one thing. It's frustrating and annoying and nobody likes that sort of thing, but I tend to believe that the points I listed previously are a bigger part of the issue. So you likely wouldn't get that sort of preachy crap regardless if you had the right kind of talent. But it's not only the inexperienced creatives, but the executives that impress their will upon every project coming out. They impress their will upon creatives who don't care enough to object. Sure, you can make a Marvel movie, just make sure it has all of these things in it, A through Z, and the rest is all yours. An absolute recipe for disaster and creative suicide. And when you've got creatives that don't know what they're doing and a massive CGI bill you've got to pay, the budgets are inevitably gonna be out of control. And that's exactly what they are. Marvel films have always boasted enormous budgets, but it's always kind of been one of those things where nobody could really talk trash because the films made so much money that it never really mattered. But it's about to start mattering a lot more. First of all, Disney just recently lost its tax-exempt status on a number of perks at its Florida parks and properties, due to the fact that they decided to go to war against a certain Florida governor over a certain Florida bill. I'm not going to get into all that, but for a company that only cares about profits yet tries time and time again to look virtuous even though they're not, they really screwed the pooch on that one. I also find it odd that you had films like The Avengers, the first Avengers movie, which cost $220 million to make, with an absolutely star-studded cast, a lot of actors to pay, including Robert Downey, Sam Jackson, Scarlett Johansson, $220 million. And then films like Thor: Love and Thunder or Wakanda Forever, which both cost $250 million apiece. Or The Marvels, which was $275 million, $50 million more than a freaking Avengers movie. I'm not gonna act like inflation isn't a thing, but holy hell, they ain't making that back. So obviously, as I mentioned earlier, I think a lot of this has to do with under-tested creatives who don't know how to manage a budget. But they're not the ones setting the budget, the studio is. So while I do think Marvel could get more bang for their buck if they invested into creatives who actually knew what to do with a multi-million-dollar budget, I think the problem is amplified by the fact that Marvel no longer knows how to make a film on a reasonable budget. Take as an example John Wick. The first John Wick movie. Everybody has either seen or is aware of the John Wick franchise. The first movie had a budget of $20 million. The film made $86 million. So if you double the budget to account for marketing, they likely spent $40 million to make it, and it made $86 million. Huge success, more than doubled their money. John Wick 2, similar deal, but times 2. $40 million budget, $170 million box office. Same pattern, doubled their money. But it's kind of a funny thing to think about. John Wick is a franchise that I would assume most of you all watching have either seen or heard of. Yet you say things like $86 million box office and it sounds so unheard of. Well, that's a regular movie, folks. Actually, not even a regular movie. That's a pretty damn big budget for a movie. $20 million is a lot of money. But then on the other side of that, you have something like Blue Beetle, DC's latest flop. It's pretty common knowledge that that movie came out, there was a fairly big marketing campaign, and it flopped hard. Articles were written, YouTube videos were made, and so on and so forth about how badly that movie did, how nobody went to see it. Well, Blue Beetle had a budget of $104 million, and it made $129 million. If you account for marketing, I'm sure the film lost a considerable amount of money. But kind of an interesting way to look at things, right? The film made significantly more than John Wick 1. Way more people went to see it than went to see John Wick. But it was considered a total flop, while the first John Wick movie was a huge success. So obviously, perspective, math, not that complicated. But that's not really my point here. I mean, it sort of is, because it's just kind of interesting, but also the fact that when you look at a typical Marvel movie budget, anywhere between $200 and $250 million, Blue Beetle's budget looks small. And when you look at Blue Beetle's budget compared to John Wick's budget, John Wick's looks small. When in reality, these are all massive numbers, massive amounts of money. It is the studio's job to make sure that a reasonable budget can be maintained while still making a good movie. I understand that with superhero movies, you're going to be spending a lot more with special effects, but speaking to my point earlier, a lot of this falls on the heads of the creatives and what they can and can't create. If Marvel keeps heading down this path of underexperienced creatives, when push comes to shove and they have to lower the budgets, they won't even be able to make a film anymore because nobody will know how to. This seems drastic, but it couldn't be more true. It has gotten to that point. Obviously, Disney has a ton of money, a ton of separate revenue streams, and so on. They can afford to screw everything up multiple times over and still come out on top. But their streaming service hasn't turned a profit since it came online. Their films aren't guaranteed to turn a profit anymore either, and creatively, Marvel is dead. I'm sure many of you tuned in to watch a video about the Marvels and how lousy it was and clearly ended up getting something else entirely. It's not lost on me, and my god, that movie was bad. I did actually go see it opening weekend, don't ask me why, but there was about 18 people in a theater that fit 150. But I find it far more interesting to see how Marvel fell so far rather than just looking at the one project. In a recent interview with CNBC, Bob Iger did address a lot of the problems and quote, creative misses at Marvel. Quality over quantity, yada yada, and honestly a lot of what he said shows that he is hyper aware of a problem. Maybe not exactly aware of why the problems are occurring, but definitely aware there is a problem. I tend to believe that if somebody pitched the Marvels today, they would have said hell no. But at the time it went into production a number of years ago, Marvel was so dead set on culture crap that they thought it was a great idea. By the time the movie was ready to come out, it was more of a let's get this over with type scenario. I'm not sure where exactly Marvel's peak was, somewhere in the 2010s I suppose, and the decline somewhere in the 2020s. But when people look back and recall the death of Marvel, when they speak to their grandchildren about the end of an era, they will recall with disdain and contempt 2023's The Marvels. I really like making these and I'd love to keep making them, so please subscribe and like the video. If you love this sort of content, consider becoming a member. See you in the next one.